There is a particular kind of courage that comes with age and experience. When a man who has spent his entire life inside an industry finally decides to speak the uncomfortable truth about it, the world tends to listen. Ron Howard has been a part of Hollywood longer than most people can remember. He was a child actor before he became one of the most respected directors of his generation, and that dual perspective, the performer who became the storyteller, gives him a vantage point that very few people possess. He has seen Hollywood from both sides of the camera, and what he has seen on the darker side has never entirely left him. In various interviews and reflections over the years, Howard has spoken with measured but unmistakable honesty about the moral rot that existed beneath the glamour of Hollywood's so-called golden age. The studios were brilliant at manufacturing legends, he has suggested, but the machinery of legend-making required silence, and silence protected people who should never have been protected. The actors who defined that era for millions of ordinary Americans were, in several cases, capable of extraordinary cruelty, predatory behavior, and breathtaking arrogance. Their names are iconic. Their crimes, in many cases, have been quietly set aside by an industry that preferred the myth to the truth. Ron Howard has never been entirely comfortable with that arrangement. What follows is a reckoning with 6 of those legends, the men and women whose darkness Howard has, in various ways and at various moments, acknowledged as part of Hollywood's hidden history. These are not rumors. They are documented patterns of behavior that survived for decades because fame, money, and institutional power made survival possible. Errol Flynn was, by almost any measure, the most naturally magnetic screen presence of the 1930s and 1940s. His athletic grace, his wicked smile, and the ease with which he inhabited adventure made him feel like someone the movies had invented. In a sense, they had. The real Errol Flynn, born in Tasmania in 1909 and arrived in Hollywood by the mid-1930s, was a man of voracious and frequently destructive appetites, and the studio system at Warner Brothers worked very hard to ensure that the public never had to confront the distance between the performance and the person. In 1942, 2 teenage girls, Peggy Satterlee and Betty Hansen, accused Flynn of statutory rape. The trial that followed was a spectacle of institutional protection. Warner Brothers deployed its most powerful legal resources. Witnesses were pressured. Public relations machinery churned out stories framing Flynn as a charming rogue being pursued by opportunists. He was acquitted, and the studio moved quickly to rehabilitate his image. But private correspondence that emerged years later showed Flynn himself making light of the accusations in terms that were deeply revealing about his actual attitudes toward women and toward accountability. Ron Howard has described reading about that era as a formative experience in understanding how Hollywood actually operated. The industry's willingness to circle its wagons around a profitable star, regardless of what that star had done, was not an accident or an exception. It was policy. Flynn spent the rest of his life consuming himself with alcohol, drugs, and financial recklessness, dying in 1959 at the age of 50 with his body, in the words of his attending physicians, resembling that of a man 20 years older. The charm that had made him a star had never been accompanied by any corresponding sense of responsibility, and the system that could have insisted on that responsibility had chosen instead to look away. Kirk Douglas built his public identity around strength, determination, and the idea of a man who had come from nothing and fought his way to everything. Born into poverty in upstate New York in 1916, his rise through the studio system and his eventual emergence as one of Hollywood's most commanding presences was, on its surface, genuinely impressive. His work on films like Champion, Ace in the Hole, and Spartacus demonstrated a ferocious commitment to his craft that could not be faked. But the same ferocity that powered his performances also manifested in ways that those who worked alongside him found difficult to endure. Crew members across multiple productions described a man whose anger was unpredictable and whose need to dominate extended far beyond any reasonable professional standard. Directors including Stanley Kubrick, who worked with Douglas on Paths of Glory and Spartacus, spoke of him as the most challenging individual they had encountered in the industry, not because of disagreements about creative choices, which are normal and often productive, but because of Douglas's fundamental unwillingness to accept limits on his own authority. The more serious allegations involve the claim raised most directly by the late Natalie Wood's sister Lana Wood in her memoir, that Douglas sexually assaulted Natalie Wood when she was 16 years old. Natalie Wood died in 1981 without ever having spoken publicly about the incident in detail. Douglas, who lived to the age of 103, never faced legal consequences. The allegation is not a rumor. It was made in print, under the author's own name, by someone with direct knowledge of her sister's experience. That it was never tested in a court of law is a function of the same institutional dynamics that protected Flynn, Wayne, and others across the same period. Ron Howard has spoken about Douglas in ways that reflect both genuine admiration for certain aspects of his work and an unflinching awareness that the man was, in important respects, a study in the dangers of unchecked power. Faye Dunaway's talent was real and undeniable. Her performances in Bonnie and Clyde, Chinatown, and Network, for which she won the Academy Award for Best Actress in 1977, represent some of the finest screen acting of the 20th century. She brought intelligence, precision, and an almost terrifying intensity to every role she undertook, and there are filmmakers and critics who would argue, with justification, that she belongs in any conversation about the greatest actresses Hollywood has ever produced. The problem was what that talent and that intensity meant for everyone who worked alongside her. The accounts of her behavior on set are numerous, consistent, and come from too many independent sources to be dismissed as exaggeration or personal grievance. Crew members across multiple productions described an atmosphere of sustained dread. Assistants were humiliated publicly and routinely. Makeup artists, lighting technicians, and directors, people who had no particular stake in undermining her, described her behavior in terms that go well beyond the ordinary difficulties of working with the demanding performer. During the production of Mommy Dearest in 1981, in which she played the notoriously abusive Joan Crawford, multiple accounts from the production suggest that Dunaway's behavior toward crew members bore uncomfortable similarities to the character she was portraying. Director Frank Perry spoke privately about the difficulty of maintaining a functioning set. The film itself, whatever its artistic merits, became something of an accidental document of the dynamics it was dramatizing. Ron Howard, discussing the broader pattern of behavior by powerful figures in Hollywood, has pointed to Dunaway as an example of how ego, when it is never challenged, eventually becomes something that those around it simply cannot survive professionally. Her isolation in later decades, as directors and studios declined to work with her, was the delayed consequence of behavior that had been excused for years because her films were successful. John Wayne, Ideology as Intimidation. John Wayne occupied a position in American culture that went far beyond ordinary celebrity. By the 1950s and into the 1960s, he had become something close to a living symbol of masculinity, of patriotism, of a particular vision of America that millions of people found deeply reassuring. His image was everywhere, and the studios were careful to protect it. The reality behind that image was considerably more troubling. On film sets, Wayne's behavior toward those with less power than himself was frequently described as intimidating and demeaning. Crew members who made mistakes were publicly humiliated. Actors who challenged his interpretations, or who brought perspectives that complicated his preferred narratives, found themselves sidelined. Christopher Mitchum, who worked with Wayne on several productions, has spoken about the atmosphere of fear that Wayne's presence could generate, not the productive tension of high standards, but the corrosive anxiety of a man who used intimidation as a management technique. Wayne's 1971 interview with Playboy magazine remains one of the most extraordinary documents of his worldview, and not in a way that reflects well on him. In that conversation, he expressed contempt for Native Americans' land rights, skepticism about the readiness of Black Americans for self-governance, and a broader hostility to any social change that challenged the hierarchies he had benefited from. These were not off-the-cuff remarks that could be attributed to tiredness or poor phrasing. They were sustained, considered positions, expressed by a man who clearly felt no need to moderate them. Ron Howard has spoken about Wayne with the complicated feeling that comes from having grown up admiring someone and then understanding, gradually and with some pain, who that person actually was. The myth was powerful. The man behind it was something considerably less admirable. Roman Polanski's case is, in certain respects, the most straightforward of any discussed here, because the facts are matters of public record and were established through legal proceedings. In 1977, Polanski was arrested and charged in connection with the sexual assault of 13-year-old Samantha Geimer at a photo shoot in Los Angeles. He pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of unlawful sexual intercourse with a minor. Before he could be sentenced, he fled the United States and has not returned in the nearly 5 decades since. What makes this case particularly relevant to any discussion of Hollywood's moral culture is not the crime itself, horrifying as it was, but the industry's response to it. A significant number of prominent figures in the film world continued to work with Polanski, defend him publicly, and argue that his artistic achievements should be considered separately from his actions. When he won the Academy Award for Best Director for The Pianist in 2003, the standing ovation he received from a room full of industry professionals was a moment that Ron Howard has described as genuinely difficult to process. The willingness of intelligent, otherwise thoughtful people to set aside the reality of what Polanski had done, and critically, the reality that he had fled accountability rather than face it, in favor of continued celebration of his films, said something deeply uncomfortable about the values the industry actually held when tested. Samantha Geimer, who has spoken publicly about her experience on multiple occasions over the decades, deserved better from an industry that claimed to care about the vulnerable. Ron Howard's position on this has been consistent. Talent creates no exemption from accountability, and the film world's long accommodation of Polanski represents one of its most significant and lasting moral failures. Mickey Rooney was, in many ways, the most complete embodiment of Hollywood's golden age. Its exuberance, its excess, and its fundamental indifference to the human cost of fame. As a child performer, he was extraordinary, possessed of a natural energy and comedic timing that seemed to bypass all the usual barriers between performer and audience. MGM constructed an entire mythology around him during the late 1930s and early 1940s, and for a brief period, he was the most commercially successful actor in the world. The personal life behind that public persona was, by any honest accounting, a sustained demonstration of self-indulgence and its consequences. 8 marriages, each of which ended badly. Compulsive gambling that consumed enormous sums of money across decades. A pattern of behavior toward the women in his life that multiple former partners described as emotionally abusive and chronically unfaithful. Judy Garland, who was perhaps his closest professional partner during the MGM years, and whose own suffering at the hands of the studio system is well documented, spoke in private about the particular cruelty that Rooney was capable of in his personal relationships, a cruelty that sat in jarring contrast to the warmth and approachability of his public performances. Rooney lived long enough, dying in 2014 at the age of 93, to see his personal and professional reputation essentially dissolve. His estate at the time of his death was valued at less than $20,000, an almost incomprehensible figure for a man who had earned millions. He spent his final years in legal disputes with family members over his remaining assets, and his body was initially unclaimed after his death. For Ron Howard, Rooney's story represents perhaps the most poignant version of Hollywood's central lie, the idea that the performance is the person, and that the person inside the performance is not suffering. Rooney performed joy for decades. The life behind a performance was a sustained catastrophe of his own making. Ron Howard's value as a witness to Hollywood's history comes not from any single story he tells, but from his ability to recognize the pattern that connects them. Errol Flynn, Kirk Douglas, Faye Dunaway, John Wayne, Roman Polanski, Mickey Rooney. These are not random examples of individual moral failure. They are case studies in what happens when an industry systematically prioritizes commercial value over human accountability. The golden age of Hollywood was golden for the people at the top of its hierarchy. For those below, the crew members, the young actresses, the people without legal resources or institutional backing, it was frequently something very different. Howard grew up inside that world, and the particular honesty he brings to discussing it comes from genuine knowledge, not second-hand indignation. The real legacy of these revelations is not scandal. It is a question. What does it take for an industry, or any institution, to choose accountability over convenience? Hollywood is still working out the answer. Ron Howard, to his considerable credit, has never stopped asking the question.